Good afternoon. I'm Rhonda Larimore, the Chief Human Resources Officer for Akron Children's Hospital. I want to welcome you today to our virtual conversation with guest professors from John Carroll University. Please welcome Professor Sydnia DeFranco and Malia McAndrew, who are going to be talking today with us about celebrating Black history in the U.S. and the Black family, representation, identity, and diversity.
Thank you. Well, I know that I'm very excited to be here today. So Malia and I are colleagues and friends. So we thought we would kind of do this more as a conversation so that it would be very accessible and appealing to everybody so that you all listen all the way through to kind of some of the things that we want to share with you today. So I thought we would start with a very kind of basic but very important question. And I know that Malia is like the best person to answer this. So I just was wondering, Malia, if you could explain to me and to the rest of us what exactly Black History Month is and maybe why we celebrate it. Like, where did that idea come from here in the United States?
Talking to you about it instead of them today. So let me talk a little bit about where this idea came from. So about 100 years ago, there were a number of African American scholars who started saying we need to have our stories told more, that there isn't enough focus on the Black experience and the way that African Americans have shaped the history of this country. That many of us, when we look at history, we tend to look at it from one viewpoint. And so the viewpoint that people have traditionally looked at history from is from the perspective of the movers and the shakers. So if you can imagine society as kind of like a triangle, right? And there's just a really few people at the very top of the triangle, the presidents and the senators and the businessmen. And most of us are ordinary people. But what historians started to say is that the lives of ordinary people are important too, because we affect change too. So let me give you like a really concrete example of how changing our perspective on history can maybe change some of the stories that we tell. So if you take a classic example and you say, how did slavery end in the United States, right? How, for hundreds of years, slavery had existed in the United States and then it didn't. So how do you get there, right? And one of the things that people often say is they'll say, well, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And that is demonstrably true. Abraham Lincoln did issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And eventually that led to the freedom of 4 million enslaved people. But it's not the whole story. And so that's where bringing in the African American history experience really becomes instructive, because when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he said, all right, anybody who's fighting against me, the enslaved people in those places are free. Now, Sydnia, do you think the people fighting against him cared what he said?
No.
Do you think they were like, oh, my enemy just said,
right.
People are free. Okay, I guess you're free to go.
Okay, we're
no,
not.
of course not. Of course not. But what was important is that enslaved people heard that, and they said, you know what? The enemy of my enemy must be my friend. Let me figure out how to get to this guy and to this place. And so really even before that, right, that what historians have uncovered is the ways in which enslaved people pushed the hand of Lincoln. But because before the Emancipation Proclamation, the government's position was that if people ran away from the South to the North, the official policy was, if you can believe it, they were supposed to return stolen, runaway property to the South, right? And at the beginning of the war, Lincoln, I know, it was a confiscation, right? Yeah. So at the beginning of the war, Lincoln was kind of like, if I have to, my main goal is keeping the Union together, right? And if I have to free enslaved people, I'll do that. If I have to free no enslaved people, I'll do that, right? But enslaved people themselves said, we're gonna force this. And so what you see mass numbers of people in the enslaved South run away from the places that they had been, go to Union lines and say, hey, can we help you out? We know a lot about your enemies. We know where they're stationed. We know where their horses are. We know the best. Did my bandwidth go out?
Yes, just for a second though.
Okay, all right. Well, let me get to the crescendo so then we can move on to the next question. Is that basically you have people, the question was, how did slavery end? Was, people freed themselves. They ran away from enslavement. They ran away from enslavement such large numbers that they forced the hand of Lincoln. That when they went to Northern lines, they proved themselves useful. They were able to help the Union cause, talking to the Union about, where to get the best supplies, how to feed their horses, what their best military strategies would be, and help that in any way. And so that forced the hand of Lincoln, right? That's why he had to issue this Emancipation Proclamation. So it's a small change, but it's a change that deepens our understanding of the ways in which, as we started with, it's not just the movers and the shakers. It's not just the people who are at the top of society who make change in our society. It's all of us. It's the people. And that's what, focusing on African American history or women's history or the history of any people can show, is the way in which ordinary people helped bring about significant change in America, right? This is a significant thing.
Right.
So
huge change.
Yeah, but
so
maybe
the celebration. Oh, sorry. I was just going to ask you. So, did the celebration for Black History Month itself, is that a more like, how recent is that as far as like that being like the month that was demarcated for this?
Yeah. So the men who started this idea were historians in the early 1900s, where the era of that time period was called the Progressive Era, right? So they wanted to progress society. They had seen a lot of things happen in society. We had, built cities, and we had electricity, and now we had all these factories. But not everybody was benefiting equally from the America that was being born. And so during this progressive era, you have many people in America trying to look out for the rights of immigrants, look out, women's suffrage. And so you have many different kind of rights movements emerging during this time period. And so that's when these men came together, and it was men at that time period, and said, let's look and let's understand our history, and let's present the progress of our community to the larger good. So it was, about 100 years ago.
Nice.
But Cydia, you focus more on the contemporary. I'm good with kind of what happened 100 years ago, 150 years ago. But I think you can talk a little bit more about, celebrating stories today. And so maybe I was thinking like you could talk a little bit about, the Black family today, about our communities today.
So, and I love that, because I don't think you can separate, right? Like, and I know you would completely agree with, like, you can't separate that history from the now, right? It obviously has affected the now. And I think that when we talk about any group, I think it's the most important thing we can do is to say that there's not one member who represents that entire group. And I think that sometimes, especially like if you're looking at movies or books about Black families or with Black characters, you'll see a lot of trend where it seems to be very much a single narrative, right? So like you'll see the very, I guess, big stereotypes, right? So you'll have like, definitely like poverty. There'll be, some kind of drugs, and the paths and or there'll be, the history part, there'll be slaves, right? So oftentimes I feel like if you are a Black parent, let's say, and you want to show your child, right? Like, okay, there's many different stories, and it's not a single narrative for our culture. And that's harder to find. So I feel like more recently, especially, I would say maybe in the past 10 years or so, there has been an explosion of more nuanced stories that present the Black family in many different lights. And I love that, because I feel like it's so empowering to be able to tell your kid, hey, let's read this book where like, and I'll show some later because I have a pile right here. You know, where we have the story, say, of a little girl who's a scientist and she's Black, right? Or like the movie Hidden Figures, right? Like stories where like you know, the Black community has been an integral player, and just in a very non-stereotypical, not that single narrative kind of thing, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, can I build upon that a little bit more, because I
Yeah.
think it's important when we talk about history too, because you've got kind of the way I see it, like kind of two competing interests that you know, most people, they don't have all day to read history books like me.
Yep.
Right? So you're only going to maybe read, you know, a book now and then. So the question is what book do you pick up, or what story do you focus on? And I think one of the reasons why we have often focused on these stories that we traditionally have is because we're interested in how change happens in society, right? There's something compelling about the story of someone who is oppressed, who is able to overcome that oppression. I think that speaks to us on a human level. And so often we do focus on those stories of people like a Martin Luther King, or the stories of people who were enslaved, and the ways in which they granted their freedom. But I think, as you said, right, the history of the Black experience is not just the history of slavery, right? It is not just the history of being enslaved. And that, you know, at the same time, if you go back, again, understanding kind of things from an individual's perspective, if you went back to somebody in the 1800s and you said to them, tell me about yourself, the first thing they're probably not going to say is, well, I'm a slave who belongs to such and such person, right? That's not people's identity. They would say the same things we say today. Well, I'm the mother of this person. I'm the daughter of this person, right? I'm a healer. I'm a member of my faith community, right? So at the same time that we're talking about people overcoming oppression, it is important, I think, when we focus on history, to focus on, you know, the rich, the expressive, the beautiful culture that was built in the United States, right? That articulated people's hopes and dreams, but wasn't simply about their condition as enslaved people, right?
Right. And I think it's also kind of interesting that that being a member of a Black family, just because of the history here in the United States, right? Even things like, you know, tracing your genealogy is a very different experience than if you were, you know, a white individual doing the same thing. So I think that the history, of course, just kind of never will not is an intrinsic part of it. And I think that that's where you kind of see like, for example, the poet Amanda Gorman, right? Like, you hear the way that she it's never going to be not based on that history, right? That kind of, but I do exactly know what you're saying, that feeling of like soaring, right? Like of getting past something that's difficult, but also that there are other people who have been through this and can relate to that. I think that that's a beautiful part of, you know, how we see that kind of richness in these new stories and in these new kind of voices. So, so Malia, I guess I was wondering if you could talk a little bit actually more about that, like what, if you've seen maybe an evolution in the Black family and how it is kind of seen like historically, you know, like, because I think that was that concept kind of had to grow somehow, right? Because it was very different when, you know, the slave owning time, when your family wasn't necessarily yours to keep in the way you wanted it to. So can you tell me a little bit about kind of how that has evolved, I guess?
Yeah. So if you want to think about the history of historically, how was family defined within the Black community in the United States, is exactly as you suggested, that family was who you were with. Family was who you were around. Family was the people that you shared the table with, because you didn't know if you would be around the same people, you know, today or tomorrow. So if we think about like like a mother, a father, children, right? The reality of slavery meant that at any time, if I'm a 12-year-old boy, I might be sold away from my mother and father in Virginia, and I might end up in Texas next week, right? So it was important for the community, in order for the community to stay together, that when I arrive in Texas, there's a family there waiting for me, right? That the entire culture was built up, upon inclusion of many different people who didn't necessarily have kin ties. That doesn't mean that kin ties weren't important. It just means that the definition of family also included people who weren't necessarily blood relatives. And so you see that even like in the creation of songs. So if you go back to traditional work songs, traditional religious hymns, they often have this call and response pattern where one person, the leader of the song, calls something out and then everybody in the group responds, right? So there's kind of two things. It doesn't matter if I just arrived here yesterday, that I used to live in Virginia and I arrived here yesterday and now I'm in Texas and I don't know anybody. The first day I arrived, I can join in that song. What I have to do is listen to what the leader says and respond with everybody. And so the ways in which culture helped to form that sense of community and the ability of people to form bonds. And then the only other thing that, you know, I'll add to that is when we're talking about the Black family and the creation of the African American community in the United States. Many times when people went through the process of Middle Passage, when individuals moved from the African continent to the North American continent, when they arrived in the Americas, they were oftentimes no longer allowed to speak the languages they spoke, or there were so many people being taken from so many different places, from so many different cultures, that oftentimes people didn't speak the same languages. And so, so new communities had to be forged, and those communities melded and came together to create what became really the history of a unique group. And a truly American group, right? Like if you want to think about like what is America, when you think about aspects of the African American experience, like the creation of, let's say, jazz music or something like that, you have parts of jazz that are very similar from European music, parts of jazz that are very similar from African music, parts of jazz that are similar to the musics of the first peoples of this place. And that created this new thing, which is American culture, right? That is shared there as well.
And I think that's
I don't know, Cynthia, what do you think? Can you, because as I said, like, I know the 200 years ago, you know, what do you see going on, kind of issues that those in the Black community, that Black families might face today? Would you change, kind of, are things different now than they were?
Well, I mean, I think looking at it from that like social justice perspective, I think that the Black family still, that sense of community is like one of the strongest, I think, and most impressive aspects of the culture. You see that still. It's a very vibrant part of the community. I also think that, you know, because of where, because of the history, again, it all just ties, where the Black, you know, community started, right, is very different, right, than where maybe other immigrants to the US started. First of all, because for most of them, it wasn't by choice that they came here, right? And they didn't start at the same level, right? They didn't have that chance. You know, if you come here as a slave, you don't have the chance, obviously, to eventually own your own farm, right? So that kind of longer, you know, that, you know, how people talk about that playing field, right? Like it's not equal. And we're not going to get into that, but I am going to talk a little bit about that idea, right? Like that it does depend, you know, if you are running a race, right? And, you know, you're starting back here and the other person's starting up here, you know, and you have the same time to run it, no matter how fast you are, you're still maybe not going to end at the same time, right? So I think that is something that the African American communities and families are still kind of dealing with from the past, right? And it's nothing that they have done, right? It's what the history is, what has happened, right? Um, I think that I think that Cleveland and Akron both share in common that the population percentages are pretty similar. I think, as far as like what the division, how, the percentage of white and blacks living in each city. And when you look at the communities, I still feel like, there's a lot of room for improvement and for support, as like with schools, with healthcare access and information. And I know, I'm sure you've read about how COVID has really affected those families more than other groups. And I do know that I've worked and talked with some members of the African American community about the group's worry about the vaccine, even, so like I think there's a lot of that, that, and I always love to say that one of the women who created the COVID vaccine was an African American woman, and I think that that's a really cool point to kind of say, look, like it is, like this is part of what I would celebrate if I was, saying, let's celebrate Black History Month, let's celebrate this woman, like an amazing scientist, right? So I think that there's so much also that like I still think we all need to learn about and be open to, and I think there's so many ways, especially now, Malia, that like we have access to maybe seeing and reading things, from anywhere, right? That before we didn't. So I think that part is super important. And I
Yeah, was there any like specific, I mean, because I know I have
Yeah.
my list of things that I would
Yeah.
suggest, like, oh, you should read this and you should read this, and when you're done,
Read this,
you should
that. I
read
know.
this.
Well,
But
that's really funny. So yesterday, I have 3 sons, so you know this. Yesterday, one of my kids loves to draw cartoons, and he loves graphic novels. And I don't know if you've ever read this. You may not have ever read this, but it's called New Kid, and the author is Gerald Graff. And
Okay.
he grew up in Harlem, and he told us, so he was live yesterday talking about how he started writing these graphic novels, and it's an amazing graphic novel. It's super accessible for any like 12 to 13 to 14-year olds who like is like, I'm never going to pick up a book, but the characters are so rich, and the protagonist is this young Black kid who goes to this private school, and it's like all these like things he has to experience, and but the characters are all very supportive, very loving, his mom and dad. I mean, it's just this wonderful book, and what he said yesterday, which I thought was so perfect, he said, there's no one way to be anything. And I said, and
Yes.
I'm sitting here watching this with my 14-year-old, and I said, yes. And he's looking at me like, oh, mom, you're crazy. But no, it's so true, right? Like, there is no one way to be anything. There is no one way to be Black, to be Latino, to be white, to be female. And I love that kind of voice that he was giving to these like new stories, right? So I just have a couple of books here. Like, well, I like, my favorite thing to do in the world is read. So I do have one series, Malia. I know you said you have a niece, a younger niece, and you may have seen these before, but they're called The Questionnaires.
Yeah.
Do you love these? And so they
Adorable.
have,
Yeah.
they're usually girls, boys, whatever, that do different things. But this little girl right here, she's Ada the scientist. And so like if you, and they're very, very cute, like super, very cute illustrations, and that like it's such a powerful story because the little girl is a scientist, right? So she's a Black little girl who's a scientist, like totally, like a very kind of empowering and nice narrative. And then of course there's like a more like middle school, you've read this, I'm sure, The Hate You Give. I love this.
Okay.
I've caught this book a few times. And then I have just a lot of like novels that are just very kind of, have you read Such a Fun Age?
No.
It's a cool story about a woman and her babysitter. The babysitter is a Black young woman, and kind of their relationship. And then I'm sure you've read this one, because this one a lot of people have read, The Vanishing Half.
Oh
Have you
yeah,
read?
my mom read that one, and she keeps telling me like,
Yeah,
you need to read that one.
it's a good one. It's, twin sisters. One of them is a lot lighter skinned than the other one. So she decides to kind of live her life passing as white, whereas the other one doesn't, and kind of how their stories vary or kind of uh, just deviate because of that. So I think they're just kind of good introductions to kind of hearing new voices. All the authors are African American authors. So I think it's a nice way to kind of get into different stories, right? Like how important those different stories can be. Um, so
Yes, and
did you
then
go grab
sorry, I
something?
got up.
I'm like, I know you went to
You
get a
can't
book.
share your own bookshelf, and I don't share my bookshelf, right? So for the parents listening,
It's that show and tell of
um,
books. I love it.
yeah. I really recommend, if you're interested in
Yes.
African American history and you're interested in the history of the Black family, everybody's reading this book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Now, what this author does is this book, it's part memoir, part call to action. And so that's why I say it's kind of interesting if you're interested in the history of the Black family. The author, Randall Kennedy, he talks about the history of his own life as an African American man from New York, and then he lives in Virginia. He goes off to a historically Black college, but he also tells the story of his family. He tells the story of his mom, the story of his dad, the story of his community. And then from that place, he talks about, how he thinks we should interact today in society with each other to start breaking down some of these barriers that have been there for members of various communities. So I say, so on one side, it's just, I think if you're interested in family, and if you're interested in the history of the Black family, that's there. But then he doesn't want to kind of leave it with that. His main thing is, he says, listen, even I have acted in my life in ways that were racist. He says, it's not, we tend to, in his words, he'll say, like, we tend to think of racism as like, the most horrible things that like humans could ever do.
Right.
And if I'm not doing like the most horrible thing that a human, then I'm not racist, right?
Right.
And his argument is, he kind of says, listen, the opposite of racist isn't not racist. The opposite of racist, he argues, is anti-racism. He's like, there are things in society. There are things pushing society this way. There are racist things pushing society this way. So none of us, even, he says, even myself, a Black man, even myself, a white woman, none of us just get to be there and sit there and be like, oh, that's too bad that's happening over there, right? He says, no, it's our job. If there are people pushing racism in this way, it's our job. You have to be anti-racist. You have to push back, right? But that's the opposite of racist is anti-racist. And so then he talks about this, like, how do you be anti-racist in your own life? What do you do? What has he done? What are the ways in which he's failed? What in the ways in which I've failed? So it's not about, so, he's saying, it's an action. It's something that you have to do. As opposed to you and I, we just, we like to read a lot of books, but we got to get off the couch and act in our own societies today.
And I love that, because I think it's a kind of something that you can start at any age. So like, I want to say this because I think this is important. So, obviously, like, if this is something that you work with and this is your life's passion, you're going to be reading about it. Like you said, you're going to be talking about it. You're going to find people like you who want to talk about it. Right. And like I said, you're going to raise your kids reading all these books. You're going to, expose them to these things. Okay. So what if you haven't done that, right? And you are, new to this, let's say. Does that mean that, it's over because you haven't had kind of this background or whatever? And the answer is no. The answer is, like, I think the first step in anything, like, especially if we're going to celebrate a culture, is to understand it, right? And how do you understand it? So, like, you're not going to be, if you're not a part of it, it's a very different experience. But I do think that you can still take the time, right, to like read the books. Like, I love that book. And there's actually, I don't know if you read it, Malia, but he wrote one for babies. It's called How to Be an Anti-Racist Baby. Have you seen it? Do you have it?
there's one for teens as well called Stamped Racism, Anti-Racism in Me. I've got that one. I won't go over to my bookshelf.
No, I love it. And the baby one,
Yeah.
you know, the baby one, I have it. I don't have it here with me, but I have it because I was like, I want to see how, you know, how do you send that message to a baby, right? And basically the story is just shows a lot of different babies of different colors, right? With their parents and different kinds of parents and like at the park, so it's just basically normalizing, right? Like that we're all here, right? Like the story again, the multiple stories, right? Like, you know, the black, you know, young child isn't, you know, necessarily just being raised in like a low income family, and maybe their experience that day is they go get ice cream, right? Like, so it's just normalizing kind of and making, you know, these multiple stories, which I love. And you're right, it's so important, right, to kind of take that angle too, and start where you are, right? Like, would you agree with that? Just start where you are, because I think that that's an important message too.
Well, I mean, there's something like you clicked onto this meeting, right? You already started.
Yeah.
Like there's
Yeah.
something in you that
That's
wants
true.
to learn about this, right?
Yeah.
So learn about it. And you know, I think that there's a million reasons, very, you know, kind of high-minded reasons why we should do something. But you know, at the end of the day, we do things because we enjoy them, right? And if you're here, then you already enjoy this. And I think that's reason enough, you know, that we want to listen to these stories from history, because they're beautiful stories, right?
Yeah.
Because they make the inside of our head a more interesting place to live our
Yeah.
lives.
Yeah.
And
And also
and
because,
yeah.
you know, where you live, where you work, you're not in a bubble, right? Like you are interacting with all
Mhm.
kinds of people and all kinds of stories, and everybody has their own story. So to deny or to not try to engage, right? Like, you know,
Mhm.
also ultimately, I think that that's kind of a gift you're giving yourself, right? That ability and that time. And
Mhm.
I know not no one has a lot of time. I think we all agree on
I
that one,
know.
right? Like no one has a lot of
Mhm.
time. But you're totally right. Just the fact that you took the time to watch and to kind of engage,
Yeah.
I think is a great message
Yeah.
that you're sending to everybody, really. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think
I
you're
don't
right.
know if
Yeah. And
no,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
I
Go
was
ahead.
gonna say, I think the focus on stories and hearing people's stories, and even if you're not, you know, like us, and you're not, you know, reading history books, which there are a
Yeah.
lot of stories, inspirational stories, but listening to the stories of people who you interact with and you come in to conversation with. I mean, just listening to people's stories, and
Mhm.
asking questions. Um, you know, not being intrusive, not being saying like, tell me your story, but all organically in our lives,
Right.
we meet a number of
True.
people, and they tell us things. They'll say, "Oh,
Yeah.
geez, it was a horrible day," right? So, you
Right.
know, maybe I respond, "Oh, it was a horrible day for me too. Let me tell you about my day," right? But, or you could
Right.
say, "Oh, it was a horrible day, Cynthia. What, you know, what's
Yeah.
up? What's
What
going on?"
happened?
Right? And yeah, and being open to listen to other people.
Mhm. Yeah. So I guess I wanted to maybe begin to wrap it up and see if we had any questions from anybody who
Hmm.
was listening. But I think just a final kind of closing notes, I guess, Malia. Is there anything else that you think would be important to kind of highlight during this month where we do celebrate Black history in the United States? And then I can also follow your statement with kind of my last closing thoughts.
Yeah, I wanted to close because, you know, in addition to being the Black History Month, we've just now celebrated the 100th anniversary of women voting in the United States, and often at the federal level. And we know that right didn't come to everyone at the same time. But one of the things we often erase is the kind of role of women of color, bringing about that right to vote. And so I have to, you know, I won't tell you the whole story. If you
No, no,
want to
no.
follow
I
it,
want to hear the whole story. I want to
oh
hear
yeah.
the whole story.
So I know. So, but
Come on, tell me the whole story.
I say that I'll just say that Akron was like where it was at in 1851. And in
Ooh, I love that.
1851, there was a conference for women's rights, and a woman who you might have heard of before, or she might be completely new, a woman by the name of Sojourner Truth stood up. And Sojourner was a person who had been born, she lived 30 years of her life enslaved. But as we said before, that's not how she defined herself. She defined herself as a mother, as the mother of
Right.
5 children, and that she wanted to create a better world for people. She also defined herself as a Christian. Her faith was very important to her. And she thought abolition and women's rights and Christianity, I mean, she viewed them all in the same way. And so she went to Akron and she preached on women's rights and African American rights. And so I think that that's like an important thing. And it's really one of the most kind of significant speeches of the women's rights movement coming from Sojourner Truth. And so she says, you know, there were a lot of people during that time period who says, you know, we shouldn't give rights to women because women are too dainty. They're too delicate. you know, and truth be told, voting was pretty nasty in the 19th century. It was not a closed ballot. But obviously, here's this woman who had lived a lot in her life, and she kind of just she said, you know, I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and I have reaped and I have husked and I have moved. And can any man do more than that? And then she was like, you know, and aren't I a woman? Right. And so this is a famous speech, and it happened in Akron.
That's
so
awesome.
I just want to give a small shout out to our friends at Akron Children's of this ferocious Black mother.
So where do you know where the speech in Akron was delivered? Do you?
Now I need to get the local historical society.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
That would be the people to reach out to.
I love that though. See, there's so much more than we don't know about. Now that you said that, it brought to mind that I took a group of students. Let's see, was this 2 years ago? To visit that church. There's a church in Cleveland, a small church, that was actually going to get, they weren't sure what their status was going to be, but it served as one of the places for the Underground Railroad. And they used the steeple as a signal, like to signal to people who were using it to hide as like, we're open, we're available, we're not. And I just love that this, you know, the history of all this is here. Like, it's so local. I think that's so cool. I love that Akron connection, and how exciting. Wow.
Yeah.
There's got to be more there than maybe physically where people can go look, Malia, I wonder, right?
Totally. So what's your big takeaway, Cynthia? What do you
I think
I go off and
yes. I think
what should I have percolating?
I think that, you know, from my perspective, I think the more that you're open, right, to hearing, like you said, other people's stories, I think the one who stands to gain is you. My kids are always teasing me because they're like, you stop and talk to everybody. And I'm like, I love people. I love hearing stories. I love hearing, you know, and vice versa. You never know, right, where that person had, what kind of a day that person had, right? Or what experience they just came through. And you may have been the only person that day that like interacted with them and gave them that time, right? So I think the gift of time, you know, is so precious to all of us because everybody's so busy and we're all kind of dealing with a million things, especially with COVID, right? Like everything has become more difficult. But just taking that moment, that gift of giving yourself to others, and also that time, you know, that you can maybe find to like, you know, read that, even a short story, read a little book, or try to, you know, like this, like you just spent about an hour listening to us talking about this issue. Like, you know, I think that that's huge. So like just giving yourself that gift of being open to others, and also being open to kind of new stories that may not be familiar to you, but where you can maybe find some shared humanity in. So I think those are kind of mine.
Exactly. All stories are our stories because we are all, we are all.
And I think it's important, right, that like, you know, nobody tells the story of a whole entire group, right? But all these experiences together, do create kind of this whole, like a mosaic of stories, which I think is such a nice kind of visual, right? Like where every bit of the story creates a greater picture. So that's kind of mine.
Excellent.
I want to thank Dr. McAndrew and Professor DeFranco for all of the information and resources and history that they've shared with us today. We will list all of the resources and links you shared with us on our diversity and inclusion page on MyKidsNet for staff to explore. If any of you have any questions, you're encouraged to email the inclusion@akronchildrenshospital.org. And I hope you've enjoyed this virtual conversation as much as I have, and we look forward to our next D&I discussion.